They didn't make me strong. They just left me alone. They didn't forget me. They walked away on purpose, just to see if I'd survive. My name is Lena Parker, and I was 11 years old the summer my mother decided that I didn't need anyone anymore. Those were her exact words, actually. "You don't need anyone now, Lena. You're independent. You can handle yourself." She said it like it was a gift she was giving me, like I should have thanked her. Instead, I stood there in the doorway holding a crumpled $10 bill while she dragged her suitcase toward the taxi waiting at the curb. She kissed the air somewhere near my forehead without really touching me and waved like she was going to the store instead of leaving the country for a month. And then she was gone. Her perfume faded out of the hallway like the last trace of a ghost, and the house swallowed itself into silence. Independent. That word rattled around inside my head like a loose screw all day. Independent meant I didn't need food plans or check-ins or neighbors knowing I was alone. Independent meant no guardian. Independent meant my mother could be halfway across the world eating pastries and taking pictures while I counted bread slices like they were treasure. Independent meant I didn't exist deeply enough in her life to be considered fragile. And at 11 years old, I learned something no child should learn. Sometimes the person who is supposed to love you most is the first one to walk away. The house changed the second she left. It didn't sound the same. It didn't breathe the same. It felt bigger, heavier, like every room was watching me. I walked to the kitchen because I didn't know what else to do. The fridge hummed at me, and I opened it like maybe some kind of magic had stocked it without me knowing. But there wasn't much there. Half a loaf of bread with corners already turning stiff, a jug of milk that was more empty than full, a few apples, one with a bruise darkening its skin, a jar of pickles I hated, random leftovers I didn't trust. The pantry wasn't much better. A box of cereal with mostly air in it, pasta with no sauce, crackers at the bottom of a torn bag. $10 wasn't going to fix that. I pressed the $10 bill flat on the kitchen table and stared at it. $10 has a smell when it's old and worn, like hands and time and places you've never seen. I wondered how many times it had changed pockets, how many people had counted on it the way I was about to. My stomach nodded even then, but I told myself I'd be fine. I have always been good at pretending. "I'll be okay," I whispered to myself, because there was nobody else there to say it to me. And sometimes, when nobody takes care of you, you start talking to yourself like you're two people, the one who's afraid and the one who's trying to calm the fear. The first night wasn't the worst. Hunger didn't scream yet. It just tugged gently. I made myself a sandwich with the thin bread and the peanut butter. I ate slowly, chewing each bite like it needed to last longer than it did. I pretended it tasted better than it did. I turned the TV on just so I wouldn't feel the quiet press on me. I picked a show I'd already seen because too much newness felt wrong when I was already full of unknowns. I fell asleep on the couch because my room felt too far away from the sound of the world. On day 2, I made the bread thinner. I spread less peanut butter. I started counting, not numbers exactly, just counting things. Crackers, remaining slices of bread, spoonfuls of cereal, hours since my mother last messaged me. Counting felt like control. Control felt like safety. And safety was something I had to manufacture myself. On day 3, I did something I didn't plan to do. I opened my notebook and I didn't write a story or a list of homework or doodles. I wrote one word at the top of the page, big enough to take up the whole line. Evidence. I don't know why I chose that word. Maybe I had heard it in a show before. Maybe my brain already understood that what was happening to me wasn't normal. Maybe I knew I needed proof of my own existence, that I wasn't just a shadow in my own house. Underneath the word evidence, I wrote age 11, alone, $10, no plan, no check-ins. And somehow, writing it down made it feel both worse and more real. It wasn't just a fog I was drifting through, it was a fact, a record, something you'd file in a drawer and pull out later and say, "This happened." By day 4, hunger stopped being a visitor and moved in. It sat beside me while I watched TV. It climbed into bed with me at night. It made my thoughts fuzzy and slow. Sometimes, when I stood up too fast, the world tilted like the floor had turned into a boat deck. I was 11 years old, but my body felt older and smaller at the same time. I tried to pretend it was fine. I pretended the rumbling in my stomach was just noise. I pretended the growing fear was just a feeling that would pass if I ignored it hard enough. And then there was the loneliness. Nobody called. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody knocked on the door by accident or rang the bell just to say hi. The world outside my windows was busy, cars driving by, people walking dogs, kids laughing, but none of that sound was meant for me. I was invisible, and being invisible hurts worse than being hungry. Hunger is a pain your body screams. Invisibility is the kind your heart whispers. I went through the cupboards again, like maybe the food would multiply if I stared hard enough, but it didn't. I finished the cereal dry out of the bag. I poured water instead of milk and pretended it tasted like something other than sadness. The bread ran out, the milk spoiled, the apples shriveled, $10 disappeared, and still nobody said my name. On day 5, my mother sent a picture. She was smiling in front of a fountain somewhere far away. In the caption, she wrote, "Finally free for a while." A heart emoji, sparkles. Free. I looked at the word for a long time. Free from what? Free from work? Free from stress? Free from me? I typed a message and deleted it. Typed it again, deleted it again. I didn't want her to think I was weak. She always said I was mature. Mature people don't beg. Mature people don't cry about sandwiches and spoiled milk. So I sent nothing, and she didn't notice the silence. On day 6, something inside me shifted. The fear didn't go away, but it stopped being alone. Something new sat beside it. Anger. Not loud, throwing things anger. Quiet anger. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that watches. The kind that writes the word evidence and underlines it. That was the day I picked up my phone, opened the camera, and pointed it at my own tired face. Day 6, I whispered. I'm still alone. I turned the camera slowly toward the kitchen, the empty shelves, the almost empty fridge, the trash can with barely anything in it. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fake, it was real, and real doesn't need exaggeration. Real just needs light. Then, on day 7, the doorbell rang. I froze, completely. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. Nobody rang our bell. Not delivery people, not neighbors, not friends. The bell rang again. Something inside me whispered, "This is the moment, Lena. This is the thread everything is going to unravel from." I opened the door just a little, and there he was, my school counselor, Mr. Bennett. "Hi, Lena," he said, gently, like he was afraid I might break if he spoke too loud. He asked where my mom was. I told him. He asked how long it had been. I told him. He asked if anyone had stayed with me. I said no. He asked if I had enough food. I didn't answer, but the kitchen did. And then he said the word that wrapped my life around a hinge and swung it somewhere new. Neglect. Not mistake, not misunderstanding. Neglect. "There are laws about this," he said, and for the first time in days, I felt something that wasn't hunger or fear. I felt seen. He called someone, and then someone else, and suddenly my house wasn't empty anymore. My neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, came over with wide, soft eyes and grocery bags that smelled like real food. The caseworker arrived with quiet questions and serious eyes. They didn't yell, they didn't blame me, they didn't ask why I didn't speak up sooner. They just looked at me like I mattered. And I cried. Really cried. Not loud, just relief leaking out of my eyes. I showed them my notebook, the word evidence, the dates, the notes, the truth. I showed them the video on my phone, my small, hungry face staring back at them from the screen. If you're seeing this, it means someone finally asked what happened. Nobody said I was dramatic. Nobody said I was lying. Nobody said I should have handled it better. They said, you should never have gone through this. They said, you are not invisible. They said, this should never have happened. They took pictures, wrote reports, arranged for me to stay with Mrs. Ramirez while they figured out what needed to happen next. And for the first time in that long, exhausting week, I slept without listening for the door. But the story didn't end there, because parents come home, trips end, and the truth doesn't stay quiet forever. When my mother finally returned, she expected hugs and stories, and a daughter who waited patiently while she chased her freedom. Instead, she walked into a house that had turned into a record, papers on the table, my notebook open to the first page, my phone with the video already cued, and people, adults, professionals, witnesses. What is this? She demanded, and I finally said the thing I hadn't dared say before, the truth. And that truth changed everything, because sometimes revenge isn't yelling, sometimes revenge isn't anger, sometimes revenge is simply refusing to pretend anymore, sometimes revenge is letting the truth speak louder than the person who tried to bury it. And when she whispered, "No, this can't be happening," I realized something important. It already had, from the moment she chose a plane ticket over her own child. And the rest of the story? And called it independence. I wasn't the problem. I was the proof. They failed me completely. People asked why I was silent, but nobody ever asked why they never checked on me. Is what happens when the truth finally knocks on the door of people who thought they'd never have to answer for the damage they caused. It doesn't scream. It doesn't break things. It just says, quietly and clearly, you don't get to forget this. Ever. That night I realized something nobody ever really teaches children. Safety is not loud. It doesn't always arrive flashing lights or heroic rescues. Sometimes safety is as quiet as the sound of someone moving around in another room. Sometimes it is knowing there will be a plate on the table when you sit down, instead of a calculation you have to do in your head about how long the food will last. In Mrs. Ramirez's house, nothing was exaggerated. She didn't throw her arms around me like I was a tragic movie character. She didn't ask 1,000 questions I wasn't ready to answer. She simply made space for me to exist. And existing without fear was something I didn't realize I had been missing until it found me. Her guest room smelled faintly of detergent and fresh sheets. I lay down without the tension that had lived in my shoulders for days. There was no clock in the room ticking loudly, reminding me of every minute I was alone. I didn't fall asleep trying to replace hunger with thoughts, or telling myself this was some challenge or test of strength. My body didn't have to defend itself. It simply rested, and sleep came like a tide washing over a shore that had been dry for too long. Morning didn't feel like a threat anymore. Sunlight slipping through the curtains didn't feel like a spotlight. It just felt like a beginning. From the kitchen, I heard the familiar rhythm of someone cooking. Eggs crack, a pan sizzles, a spoon taps the side of a bowl. Those sounds wrapped around me in a way that words never could. When I sat down at the table, Mrs. Ramirez didn't stare at me like I might shatter into glass. She just smiled the same way she probably did every day, and asked, gently, whether I preferred jam or butter. It was a simple question, but simple questions are only simple when you are used to being cared for. At school, eyes followed me like shadows. Kids don't always know how to react to pain unless it comes with simple explanations, and my story was anything but simple. Some looked at me with pure concern, others with curiosity, and some avoided me altogether. Whispers floated down hallways, not cruel ones, just confused ones. I heard questions asked in low voices. Why didn't she say something sooner? Wasn't there anybody she could call? The funny and painful thing about those questions is that they always began with the assumption that the child had choices. Nobody ever thought to ask why the adults didn't. Mr. Bennet was different. He didn't pry open old wounds just to look inside them. Sometimes he simply sat in the empty classroom with me before school started, drinking his coffee while I pretended to read. There was no pressure to speak. Silence didn't hang heavy between us. It rested. When you've been ignored long enough, even simple acknowledgement can feel like rescue. The visits with my mother began soon after that. They were stiff at first, like two actors who hadn't rehearsed their lines. We sat across a table under the soft hum of fluorescent lights, with a caseworker in the corner scribbling into a notebook, a witness to our fractured universe. My mother wore bright lipstick and a strained smile, and her hands trembled slightly whenever they rested on the table. She talked too fast, trying to patch holes in reality with words. She asked how school was, whether I was comfortable, whether I needed anything, but the questions floated above the real ones that neither of us could ask out loud yet. Why did you leave me? Why didn't you check? Why did I matter last? She brought gifts like apologies you could hold, a sweater I didn't need, a necklace I never wore, candy I no longer craved. I thanked her politely because manners were something she had always made sure I learned. But politeness isn't the same thing as forgiveness, and distance isn't always measured in miles. Sometimes the space between two people can stretch across a table. I went to therapy every week after that. At first, I thought it was strange to sit in a room and say out loud things that had once only existed inside my head. But slowly, I realized therapy wasn't about fixing the past. It was about learning that none of what happened had ever been my job to endure. I learned that children are not supposed to be emergency plans. I learned that calling a child strong can sometimes be another way of saying, we expect you to survive what you never should have been put through. My mother started therapy too. I didn't see what happened in those rooms, but I saw pieces of it in the way she changed, slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly, but genuinely. She began to talk less and listen more. She didn't rush to explain every mistake away. Sometimes she would fall silent in the middle of a sentence, like she had stumbled into the truth and didn't quite know how to stand inside it. The first time she looked at me and said, with no excuses, "I failed you," I felt something inside me loosen that I didn't even know had been clenched. That didn't erase the past. It just meant we weren't pretending anymore. Still, there were nights when guilt curled up at the foot of my bed like a stray cat. What if I had ruined everything? What if I had broken my own family by letting the truth air out instead of hiding it? But then I would remember the ache in my stomach, the empty clatter of bowls in a bare kitchen, the way my phone lit up only for postcards of foreign cities instead of questions about whether I had eaten, and I would realize I didn't break anything. I simply stopped carrying the weight of their choices alone. Living with Mrs. Ramirez never felt like replacing my mother. It felt like breathing in a room with open windows. She didn't try to fix me or force smiles out of me. She taught me small things: how to cook simple meals, how to organize my schoolwork, how to recognize when my body was tired instead of ignoring it. She asked permission before hugging me. She respected my moods. She understood silence. My old house didn't change on the outside. The curtains still hung in the same folds, the driveway still cracked in the same place, but inside me the meaning of that house had shifted. It became a place I had survived instead of a place I belonged. Supervised visits softened as the months passed. My mother's voice stopped sounding defensive. She started asking questions that didn't begin with "why didn't you?" and instead shifted toward "how did it feel when?" And I answered, sometimes carefully, sometimes angrily, sometimes through tears, sometimes with long pauses. But I answered, not because my words owed her anything, but because my words finally had somewhere safe to land. She told me one day that she had convinced herself that leaving me was proof of trust, that she had built a false version of me in her head, an endlessly capable, unbreakable child, so she didn't have to face the ways she was failing. She kept calling me mature because it made her feel less guilty, she whispered. And in that sentence, years of confusion suddenly had a place to sit down. I didn't forgive her instantly. Forgiveness is not a light switch. It's a slow, cautious hand reaching forward in the dark. But I did begin to understand that acknowledging harm is the first fragile bridge to building something better. Courts reviewed things again months later. There were evaluations, reports, interviews. My life existed in files now, neat paragraphs describing the messiness of human love and failure. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no slamming doors, just paperwork, signatures, and decisions made in voices soft enough not to echo. But those quiet decisions shaped the rest of my life more than any loud argument ever had. And somewhere in all that silence, I learned that my worth was not measured by how much I could survive without complaining. I learned that it is okay for a child to say, "I need you." I learned that love without responsibility is just neglect wrapped in sentiment. And I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. I started laughing again, not the careful, polite laughter people use when they don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Real laughter, the kind that shakes loose the dust inside your chest. And when I cried, I didn't hide it, and nobody called it drama. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just living. Weeks turned into months, and somewhere in between all the meetings and the paperwork and the quiet evenings at Mrs. Ramirez's house, life began to feel real again. Not perfect, not healed overnight, just real. The kind of real where you wake up and know someone will ask if you ate breakfast, where you know the fridge will not be empty when you open it, where you don't have to pretend strength to earn care. I still went to school. I still sat with Mr. Bennett sometimes. I still wrote in my notebook, though the word evidence slowly stopped feeling like a shield and started feeling like a memory, a reminder of the girl who refused to disappear. Supervised visits with my mother were strange at first. We would sit in a quiet room with neutral walls and folding chairs that made every movement sound louder than it needed to. There was always someone in the corner, writing notes or watching quietly, making sure nothing went wrong. My mother would smile too hard, talk too much, try too eagerly. She brought gifts sometimes, things she thought might make me forget. New shoes, a bracelet, a journal I never wrote in. She never understood that what I needed wasn't something wrapped in ribbon. What I needed was something I never got before. Presence. Real presence. At first, she would talk about herself, how embarrassed she was, how judged she felt, how everyone thought she was a bad mother now. She cried sometimes, real tears, but I noticed how often those tears were about how the world treated her, not about how she treated me. Sometimes I wondered if guilt was just another emotion she used to feel better about herself, but other times there were cracks in the performance, quiet moments where she would look at me and her voice would drop and she would whisper, "I really didn't think it through. I convinced myself you were fine because I needed to believe it." Needed. That word sat between us like something heavy neither of us wanted to pick up. Sometimes I talked, sometimes I didn't. Nobody forced me. That was the difference now. Everything wasn't about making other people comfortable. It was about truth. Therapy became part of our lives too, separate at first, then sometimes together. I learned new words there. Words like emotional neglect, words like parentification, words like boundaries. I learned that being told you are mature is not always a compliment. Sometimes it is an excuse. I learned that love and damage can live in the same house, that you can miss someone and still fear them failing you again, that you can want your mother and still need distance. She learned things too, I think, or at least the parts of her that wanted to. She learned that responsibility doesn't disappear when you close a door behind you, that freedom without accountability is not freedom, just escape, that children are not proof of your strength, they are people who need you. There were days I felt guilty. Of course there were. There were nights where I lay awake wondering if maybe I had ruined my own family, if maybe I should have stayed silent, if maybe this all could have been fixed quietly without courts and supervision and files in government drawers with our names on them. But then I would remember day 3, day 4, day 5, the empty shelves, the twisting in my stomach, the way my phone never lit up for me. And I would remember that I didn't break something that was whole, I revealed something that was already fractured. One day after school, I walked past my old house. It looked the same from the outside, the same paint, the same porch light, the same windows reflecting the sky, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a story I had already stepped out of, a story I no longer had to survive in. My mother eventually stood in front of a judge and admitted what she did, not because she wanted to, because the truth had corners she could no longer round off. She said the words neglect. She said poor judgment. She said, I'm trying to be better. I don't know if the judge believed her fully. I don't know if I did either. But I knew this. Accountability had finally been bigger than pride. She didn't go to jail. This wasn't a movie. Real life doesn't always punish people in loud, dramatic ways. Sometimes the punishment is quieter, being supervised, being questioned, being unable to pretend everything is fine, being forced to see the consequences of your actions in your child's eyes. Supervised visits slowly became less stiff. She stopped talking so much about how she felt. She started asking how I felt. Not perfectly, not always at the right time, but she tried. And effort matters. She would sit there and listen while I told her what the nights felt like when I counted the slices of bread and prayed the milk wouldn't spoil. She didn't try to interrupt it with excuses anymore. Sometimes she just cried and said, I don't have a defense for that. There is a strange kind of power in hearing that from the person who hurt you. Not revenge, just validation, just the simple acknowledgement that you weren't crazy, that what happened to you really happened. Months later, the court re-evaluated the case. By then, I wasn't as fragile, I wasn't as raw. I had people, stability, a voice that I had learned to use without shaking. The judge allowed visits to continue, still supervised, but with the possibility of change if progress continued. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't punishment, it was conditional hope. I still lived with Mrs. Ramirez, and in that house, healing didn't look dramatic. It looked like helping with groceries. It looked like laughing at something on TV. It looked like someone asking, did you eat, before you had to remember hunger on your own. It looked like being told to sleep, to rest, to breathe. It looked like being a child again. Finally. I never stopped missing the idea of a mother, the version of her I wish I had, the version that would have stayed. But slowly, I stopped blaming myself for not being enough to make her stay. One afternoon, months after it all began, my mother looked at me across the table in the supervised room and said something she had never said before. She said, I thought you could handle it because I've always needed you to be strong, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry that I turned my child into my safety net instead of being hers. I didn't say anything for a long time, because apologies are easy, change is hard. But that day, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not panic, not defensiveness, just truth. We're not suddenly healed. We're not suddenly a picture-perfect family. There are still court dates, still evaluations, still fear that it could all fall apart again, but there is also something else now. Something soft, something fragile, something real. Accountability, boundaries, and choice. I choose when I see her. I choose when I speak. I choose when to say no, and nobody calls that disrespect anymore. They call it safety. Sometimes I think back to that quiet kitchen, to the humming fridge, to the $10 bill, to the notebook with the word evidence scrawled across the top. I think about the girl who started writing not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted proof she had existed, that she had mattered, that what happened to her wasn't just a bad dream. That girl saved me. And if I ever meet someone like her someday, a child who thinks strength means silence and independence means being forgotten, I will tell her this: you are allowed to need people. You are allowed to say you're not okay. You are allowed to take up space in the world without apologizing for the weight of your existence. And if the truth shakes the walls around you, let them shake. Because sometimes the loudest, strongest, most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. And that is not revenge. That is survival with dignity. That is growing back. That is choosing yourself. And I finally did.